Texas, 1945. The mess hall doors swung open to reveal long tables piled with scrambled eggs, bacon strips glistening with fat, and toast stacked like golden bricks. 32 German women stood frozen at the threshold, faces gaunt, eyes wide, breathing in smells they hadn't known in years. They had expected punishment. Instead, they found breakfast. The war had followed them across an ocean. These weren't soldiers. They were nurses, clerks, radio operators captured when the Reich collapsed. Their last meals in Germany had been turnip soup and black bread mixed with sawdust. One woman, Greta Holzer, would write in her diary that night, "I thought the Americans were joking. I thought it was a test." The journey to Camp Hearn had taken 3 weeks. From Bremen to Southampton, Southampton to New York, New York to the flat expanse of West Texas where the horizon swallowed everything: fear, memory, identity itself. The women had been told Americans were crude and wasteful, that the enemy hoarded wealth while the world starved. Propaganda Minister Goebbels himself had declared that captured Germans would face barbarism. The mess hall sergeant, a man named Buck Peterson from Amarillo, watched them hesitate. He was 43, too old for combat, broad-shouldered with hands scarred from ranch work before the war. He'd seen prisoner groups before, sullen, defiant, or terrified. These women looked like ghosts. "Come on in," he said, gesturing to the tables. "Ain't gonna bite you." No one moved. Peterson walked to the nearest table, picked up a plate, filled it with eggs and bacon and 2 slices of toast. He set it down at the head of the first table, then stepped back. The women stared at the plate like it might explode. Greta was 29, a former radio operator from Hamburg. She'd spent the last year of the war in a concrete bunker, intercepting Allied transmissions, surviving on rationed horse meat and potato peels. Her hands trembled as she approached the table. The bacon smelled like something from another lifetime. Christmas morning before the war, her father's kitchen, safety. She sat. The others followed, moving slowly, taking seats along the benches. The mess hall filled with the scrape of wood on concrete, the rustle of prison-issue dresses, breathing. Peterson and 2 other sergeants began filling plates. They moved efficiently, piling food high: 3 eggs per woman, 4 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of toast with butter melting into the crust. They set pitchers of milk on each table, ceramic jugs sweating condensation in the Texas heat. Greta picked up her fork. The metal felt heavy, real. She cut into the eggs, watched yellow yolk bleed across the plate, mixing with bacon grease. She lifted the fork to her mouth. The taste hit her like a physical force. Salt, fat, protein. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. Tears started down her face, silent, unstoppable. Up and down the tables, other women were crying too. Some tried to hide it, heads down, shoulders shaking. Others gave up and sobbed openly while they ate. The bacon was crispy at the edges, tender in the middle. The eggs were soft, rich, seasoned with pepper and butter. The toast was still warm. Greta wrote in her diary that evening, "This is the best food I've ever had, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. They fed us like humans, like we mattered." By the 3rd day, the women had stopped expecting cruelty. Camp Hearn sprawled across 200 acres of scrubland northeast of Abilene, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers that looked more decorative than functional. The guards carried rifles but rarely touched them. Most were locals, farmers, and ranchers who treated guard duty like any other job. Necessary, unremarkable, vaguely boring. The women were housed in wooden barracks with screened windows and fans that turned lazy circles in the afternoon heat. Each woman had a cot with a real mattress, a footlocker, a towel. The latrines had hot water. The first time Greta took a hot shower, she stayed under the spray until her skin turned pink, washing away months of accumulated grime and fear. Meals followed a rhythm that became almost ceremonial. Breakfast at 7, eggs, bacon or sausage, toast, oatmeal, coffee with real cream. Lunch at noon, sandwiches with thick slices of ham or turkey, potato salad, fruit, apples, oranges, sometimes canned peaches swimming in syrup. Dinner at 6, roasted chicken or beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans or corn, pie for dessert. The portions were staggering. Greta had grown up in a culture of careful rationing even before the war. You took what you needed, never more. Here the sergeants encouraged seconds, thirds. Plenty more where that came from, Peterson would say, hauling out another tray of rolls or another pot of stew. For women who had spent years scraping by on progressively smaller rations, who had seen children fight over crusts of bread and grown men weep at the sight of an egg. The abundance was incomprehensible. It felt like a fever dream, like propaganda in reverse. Too good to be real, but real nonetheless. Margaret Schneider, a 35-year-old former clerk from Berlin, struggled most with the waste. At dinner on their 5th night, she watched an American guard scrape half a plate of uneaten food into a garbage bin. The potatoes, the meat, the bread, all going to waste while Europe starved. She felt something twist in her chest, anger mixed with grief, mixed with confusion. Later that week, Margaret approached Peterson in the mess hall after breakfast. She spoke in careful English, words she'd practiced for an hour beforehand. "Excuse me. The food. So much. People in Germany. They have nothing." Peterson set down the tray he was carrying. He looked at her for a long moment, considering. Then he nodded. "I know. War's a terrible thing." He paused. "But you're here now. Might as well eat." It wasn't profound. It wasn't even particularly comforting. But something in his tone, matter of fact, without judgment, made Margaret's throat tighten. She nodded and walked away. The heat over Camp Hearn shimmered like glass that July. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees by midday, making the barracks ovens and the parade ground a furnace. The women learned to move slowly, conserving energy, seeking shade under the mess hall overhang or the sparse cottonwood trees that dotted the camp perimeter. Work assignments began in the 2nd week. Nothing brutal. Mostly kitchen duty, laundry, basic maintenance. Greta was assigned to help in the mess hall, peeling potatoes and washing dishes alongside 2 other German women, and a rotating cast of American soldiers who treated the work with good-natured resignation. It was there, elbow-deep in soapy water, that Greta had her first real conversation with an American. Private Danny Reeves was 19, from a tiny town in Oklahoma, fresh-faced with a drawl so thick she struggled to understand him at first. He was washing pots while she dried plates. "You speak English pretty good," he said, scrubbing at a burned spot on a pot's bottom. "Thank you, I learn in school." Her accent was heavy, consonants clipped. "What part of Germany you from?" "Hamburg, north, by the ocean." Danny nodded like he knew where that was, though she suspected he didn't. "Must be different from here." "Very different." She glanced out the window at the endless flat expanse, the bleached sky. No trees, no water. "Yeah, takes some getting used to. I'm from Oklahoma myself, similar to this, just with more rain." He grinned. "My mama would have a fit if she knew I was doing dishes. She always said that's women's work." Greta almost smiled. "In Germany also, but war changed things." "Sure does." Danny finished the pot, set it on the drying rack. "Hey, you like the food here? I mean, compared to before?" The question hung in the steamy air. Greta chose her words carefully. "Is very good. More than I expect." She paused. "In Germany, last year, we have nothing. Bread with sawdust, soup from potato peels, children eating grass." Danny's expression shifted. Surprise, discomfort, something like shame. "Jesus, I knew it was bad, but—" "The war," Greta said simply. "Make everyone hungry." They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of washing and drying, metal clanking against metal. Outside, a guard shouted something about mail call. A truck rumbled past, kicking up dust. "My cousin died at Normandy," Danny said suddenly. "Michael. He was 22. Greta stopped drying. She didn't know what to say. Sorry seemed inadequate. She'd lost people too. Her brother at Stalingrad, her uncle in an air raid, friends who simply disappeared in the chaos of the war's final months. "War is terrible for everyone," she said finally. Danny nodded. Yeah, it is." By midsummer, the rhythms of camp life had become routine. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bell clanging across the compound. Morning formation for roll call, then breakfast. Work assignments until lunch. Afternoons spent in whatever shade could be found, reading or writing letters or simply sitting still. Dinner at 6. Evening hours of relative freedom, cards, conversation, music from the guard's radio drifting across the grounds. The food remained extraordinary, not just in quantity but in variety. The mess hall served dishes the women had only read about or seen in magazines. Fried chicken with biscuits and honey, barbecued ribs with coleslaw, hamburgers with thick slices of cheese and tomato. One Sunday, Peterson organized a special dinner. Roasted turkey with all the trimmings, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, gravy, 3 kinds of pie for dessert. Greta sat at her usual table, plate loaded with food, and felt tears threaten again. Not from hunger satisfied, but from the sheer absurdity of it. 6 months ago, she'd been huddled in a bunker, gnawing on dried bread, listening to bombs fall. Now she was eating turkey dinner in Texas, served by former enemies who smiled and asked if she wanted seconds. The propaganda had been so complete, so pervasive. Americans were monsters, subhuman, incapable of civilization. They were cowboys and gangsters, violent and crude. And yet here was Buck Peterson, a rancher from Amarillo, carefully carving turkey and making sure everyone had enough cranberry sauce. Here was Danny Reeves, washing dishes and talking about his dead cousin with a kind of quiet dignity that had nothing to do with weakness. Lisa Bauer, a former nurse from Munich, voiced what many were thinking one evening after dinner. She was 32, dark-haired, with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering. "They're not what we were told," she said, speaking German in the barracks that night. "The Americans, they're ordinary people." Margaret looked up from the letter she was writing. "Propaganda, all of it. We were lied to. We believed it, though," Greta said quietly. "We wanted to believe it." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. If they'd been lied to about Americans, what else had been lies? The superiority of the Reich, the necessity of the war, the promises of victory. The foundations of their world were cracking, not through violence or forced re-education, but through bacon and eggs, through conversations over dishwater, through the simple act of being treated like human beings. The breakthrough came in August. A shipment of supplies arrived with an unexpected addition, a Victrola record player and a stack of records. The camp commander, Colonel James Harrison, set it up in the mess hall one evening and let the music play during dinner. The first record was Swing, Benny Goodman's orchestra, bright and brassy, impossible not to move to. Then some Glenn Miller, In the Mood, horns sliding and drums popping. The Americans grinned and tapped their feet, a few guards doing little 2 steps between tables. The German women sat frozen at first, uncertain. Music had been rationed like food back home. Only approved compositions, martial and severe. This was something else entirely. Joyful, chaotic, alive. Then Lisa started tapping her foot. Just a small motion, almost unconscious. Greta saw it and smiled. Margaret hummed along to a melody she couldn't possibly know but felt instinctively. By the third song, Chattanooga Choo Choo, half the women were swaying in their seats. Peterson, emboldened by the atmosphere, approached Lisa's table. He was holding a piece of pie, apple with a lattice crust. "Try this," he said, setting it in front of her. "My wife's recipe. Well, technically her mama's recipe, but you get the idea." Lisa picked up her fork. The pie was still warm, cinnamon and butter and sugar making the barracks smell like a bakery. She took a bite. Her eyes widened. "This is..." She struggled for English words. "Beautiful, beautiful, delicious, very delicious." Peterson's face split into a genuine smile. "Wait till you try her pecan pie. That'll really knock your socks off." That night, Greta wrote in her diary, "I think I understand now. The food isn't just food, it's a language. It's how they're telling us that we're not enemies anymore, that we can be something else." The letters started arriving in September. Mail call became a daily event of nervous anticipation. Most women heard from family. mothers and sisters writing from occupied Germany, describing conditions that made Camp Herne seem like paradise by comparison. Food remained scarce, buildings lay in ruins, winters were going to be brutal without proper heating. Greta received a letter from her mother in Hamburg. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and cheap. Her mother described queuing for hours to receive a single loaf of bread, watching children scavenge in rubble for anything edible, the constant hunger that became a companion more reliable than hope. "We are grateful you are safe," her mother wrote. "Even if you are a prisoner, at least you have food. At least you have shelter. That is more than many here can say." Greta read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in her footlocker. That evening at dinner, she looked at the pork chops on her plate, the green beans glistening with butter, the dinner rolls soft and warm. The guilt was overwhelming. She wasn't alone. The other women struggled with the same thing. The cognitive dissonance of eating well while loved ones starved, of being cared for by former enemies while their own country descended into chaos and privation. It created a strange kind of survivor's guilt mixed with a dawning realization. Maybe being captured had been the best thing that could have happened to them. Lisa articulated it one afternoon during a rare moment of shade beneath a cottonwood tree. She was writing a letter home, choosing her words carefully. "What do I tell them?" she asked Greta and Margaret. "That I'm eating 3 meals a day? That the Americans are kind? That I'm comfortable?" "Tell them the truth," Margaret said. "The truth might break their hearts." Greta looked out at the camp, the wooden buildings shimmering in the heat, guards smoking cigarettes and talking about baseball. "The truth is complicated. The truth," Lisa said quietly, "is that I'm starting to forget what it feels like to be hungry. And that terrifies me." By October, something had shifted in the camp. The women no longer flinched when guards approached. Conversations between prisoners and Americans became common, halting, often comically confused due to language barriers, but genuine nonetheless. The mess hall transformed from a place of silent, fearful eating into something approaching a community dining hall. One afternoon, Peterson asked Greta if she knew how to make German food. She blinked, surprised by the question. "Of course, but we don't have the ingredients." "What if we did?" It took 2 weeks to arrange. Peterson contacted suppliers, called in favors, consulted with the camp commander. Then one morning, the kitchen received a delivery. Sauerkraut, various sausages, rye flour for proper bread, even some spices that approximated German seasoning. "You're going to teach us to make German food," Peterson told Greta and Lisa. "Figure the boys might enjoy something different. Plus, seems only fair you get a taste of home." The cooking session was chaos. Peterson and 3 other American cooks tried to follow Greta and Lisa's instructions, struggling with unfamiliar techniques and measurements that didn't quite translate. But by evening, they'd produced something reasonably authentic. Bratwurst with sauerkraut, potato dumplings, dark bread, even a passable attempt at apple strudel. The mess hall filled with smells that made the German women's eyes water, not from sadness this time, but from sudden, overwhelming nostalgia. This was the smell of their mothers' kitchens, of family dinners, of a world that felt impossibly far away. When dinner was served, Greta took a bite of the bratwurst and felt her throat close up. It wasn't perfect. The sausage was slightly off, the sauerkraut too sweet, but it was close enough to remember, close enough to hurt. Peterson watched the women's faces, saw the tears, and looked worried. "Is it bad?" "We tried to follow your instructions, but—" "No," Lisa interrupted, speaking through tears. "Is perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much." That night, Greta wrote, "Today we cooked German food in Texas, taught by women who 6 months ago were enemies, served to American soldiers who laughed at our jokes even when they didn't understand them. I think the war is truly over. Not officially, but here in this place it's over." The winter came late to West Texas. Temperatures dropped slowly through November, the brutal heat giving way to cool mornings and chilly nights. The mess hall added soup to the dinner menu, thick, hearty concoctions loaded with vegetables and meat, served with cornbread or biscuits. The women received winter coats, proper ones with wool lining and buttons that actually closed. They received blankets, socks, gloves. The barracks got small heaters that glowed red in the darkness, taking the edge off the cold. Christmas planning began in early December. Peterson announced there would be a special dinner on Christmas Eve. Turkey, ham, all the trimmings, plus something he called all the pies you can eat. He also asked if the women wanted to contribute anything to the celebration. Lisa, Margaret, and 3 others spent days preparing traditional German Christmas cookies, Lebkuchen and Pfeffernuss and Springerle, working with supplies the camp provided and improvising when ingredients weren't available. The kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and cloves and honey, smells so deeply associated with Christmas that several women had to step outside to compose themselves. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was decorated with paper chains and pine branches cut from trees near the camp perimeter. Someone had rigged up electric lights that glowed warm in the evening darkness. The tables were pushed together to create one long surface, and Germans and Americans sat side by side, passing plates and serving each other. The food was magnificent. Turkey and ham, mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes, green beans and corn and rolls and gravy. The German cookies were arranged on platters, delicate and perfect. Someone had found candles, and their soft light made everything feel sacred, suspended from normal time. Peterson stood at the head of the table. He wasn't a speech maker, but he cleared his throat and everyone quieted. "I'm not much for fancy words," he said, "but I figure Christmas is a good time to say that. Well, that we're all just people. War makes us forget that sometimes. Makes us think the enemy is something other than human. But sitting here eating together, I think we all know better now." He raised his coffee cup. "To peace, and to going home soon, all of us." "To peace," the room echoed, Germans and Americans together. Greta lifted her cup, feeling the weight of the moment. Around her, women were crying openly. Guards looked uncomfortable but moved, and the future felt less terrifying than it had in years. The telegram came in January 1946. The war had officially ended months ago, but the logistics of repatriation were complex and slow. German POWs across the United States were being processed for return, medical checks, paperwork, transport arrangements. The women of Camp Hearn learned they would be shipping out in February. Destination: Bremen, then home to whatever remained of their former lives. The news created a strange mood in the camp. Relief, certainly. Most wanted desperately to see family, to return to familiar landscapes. But also something like grief. They'd spent months in a strange liminal space, neither free nor truly imprisoned, cared for by people who had every reason to hate them, but chose something else instead. Greta found herself in the kitchen one afternoon, helping Peterson prep vegetables for dinner. They'd fallen into this routine over the months. Her assistance had become less about prisoner labor and more about something approaching friendship. "You'll be glad to get home," Peterson said, not looking up from the onions he was chopping. Yes and no. Greta struggled to express the complexity of her feelings. "I miss my family very much. But here I learned something. About American people. About kindness." Peterson nodded slowly. "War does terrible things, but I figure the least we can do is try to patch things up after. Can't punish folks forever for the sins of their government. In Germany, we thought you are monsters. Yeah, well, we thought the same about you." He paused. "Turns out we're all just people trying to get by." Greta felt tears starting again. She'd cried more in the past year than in her entire previous life. "I will remember this place, these meals, the kindness. I will tell people." "You do that." Peterson handed her a bowl of chopped onions. "And maybe someday, when things are better, you can come back as a visitor instead of a prisoner. I'll make you the best chicken fried steak you've ever had." She laughed through her tears. "Is a promise. It's a promise." The final meal was held on February 14, 1946, Valentine's Day in America, though that meant little to the German women. What mattered was that it was their last night at Camp Hearn, their last night of abundance before returning to a country devastated by war. Peterson and his kitchen crew outdid themselves. Steak, rare and tender, with baked potatoes and sour cream and butter. Salad with real lettuce and tomatoes, a luxury even in peacetime Germany. Fresh rolls, soft and warm. Apple pie with ice cream for dessert. The women ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying to memorize the taste, the texture, the feeling of fullness without fear. They knew what awaited them in Germany. Rubble, hunger, shame, the long work of rebuilding a nation that had destroyed itself. Lisa looked around the mess hall, at the faces of women who had become her community, at the American soldiers who had become something like friends. "We should remember this," she said. "Not just the food, but what it meant." Margaret nodded. "That enemies can become human again. That kindness matters more than victory." Greta added, "That food is more than survival, is communication, is hope." After dinner, as the women filed out of the mess hall for the last time, Peterson stood by the door. He shook hands with each one, pressed small wrapped packages into their hands. Cookies, chocolate bars, small luxuries for the journey home. When Greta reached him, she couldn't speak. She just gripped his hand hard, trying to convey everything she felt: gratitude, sadness, hope, confusion. "You take care of yourself," Peterson said gruffly. "And remember, doors open both ways. War's over, future's what we make it." The morning of departure was cold and clear. The women lined up with their small bundles of belongings, wearing the same prison-issue dresses they'd arrived in, but carrying themselves differently now. Straighter, stronger, less afraid. The bus that would take them to the train station idled in the compound, exhaust making white clouds in the freezing air. Guards stood around, not vigilant so much as present, saying goodbye. As the women boarded, Greta turned back for one last look at Camp Hearn. The wooden buildings, the guard towers, the endless Texas sky. The mess hall where she'd eaten her first real meal in years, where she'd learned that enemies could share food and conversation, where the propaganda she'd believed her entire adult life had dissolved one breakfast at a time. She thought about her diary, pages filled with observations and realizations, about the packages of cookies in her bag, about Danny Reeves, who'd shown her a picture of his family farm and talked about planting seasons, about Buck Peterson, who'd fed them like humans when he could have treated them like animals. The bus pulled away, dust rising behind the wheels. Through the window, Greta watched Camp Hearn recede into the distance, shimmering in the morning light like a mirage. But it wasn't a mirage. It had been real. The food, the kindness, the slow transformation from enemy to person. And that reality, that memory, would travel with them back across the ocean, back to a Germany that needed desperately to believe in the possibility of redemption. Years later, historians would examine the American POW camp system and debate its effectiveness as re-education. They would analyze statistics, interview subjects, write papers about the dissolution of Nazi ideology. But the real story wasn't in the statistics. It was in moments like these, in bacon and eggs, in turkey dinners, in German cookies baked in a Texas kitchen. It was in Greta Holzer, who returned to Hamburg and became a translator, who spent decades promoting German-American friendship, who would eventually visit Buck Peterson in Amarillo in 1962 and eat that promised chicken fried steak, sitting in his kitchen and laughing about old times. It was in Lisa Bauer, who worked as a nurse in the reconstruction efforts, who told everyone who would listen about the American guards who had treated German prisoners with dignity when they could have chosen cruelty. It was in Margaret Schneider, who wrote a memoir in the 1970s about her experiences, who titled one chapter "The Breakfast That Changed Everything," and described in precise detail the taste of bacon after years of starvation, the feeling of being fed by enemies who chose to be something else instead. The war had been fought with weapons and armies, with bombs and bullets and terrible ideologies. But in places like Camp Hearn, peace was built differently, one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one small act of human kindness at a time. The women who passed through that camp never forgot the taste of American food. But more than that, they never forgot what that food represented, The possibility of change, the power of compassion, the reality that even in the aftermath of history's most terrible war, people could choose to feed each other instead of destroying each other. That choice mattered. It still matters. In a mess hall in West Texas on mornings when the light came through the windows just right, when bacon sizzled and coffee brewed and women who had been enemies became people again, that's where the real victory was won. Not over bodies, but over hatred. Not through force, but through the simple, revolutionary act of sharing a meal. The horizon swallowed the war. What remained was memory and hope, and the knowledge that kindness, when offered freely, can be the most transformative force in the world.